Hi, this is Sheb Varghese. Welcome to the Faith Colloquium podcast. Today my guest is Joel Potter. Joel did his PhD at the State University of New York at Buffalo, and he teaches philosophy at the University of Alaska, Anchorage. And today we're talking about Plato and emotions. So Joel, thanks for talking with me.
Hi, Sheb. Thanks for inviting me.
Of course. So you did your PhD work on Plato. I'm curious to hear how you got interested in Plato and wanting to do a PhD on this.
Well, since my undergraduate days, I've had a strong sense that there's great value in returning back to the ancients in order to understand our current situation. And it's kind of like a journey into another culture, another country. And it sometimes it's disorienting, but you begin to see your own assumptions in a different light. And so I really gravitated to the study of ancient philosophy. And then at the same time, I had an interest in specific issues having to do with emotion theory, and contemporary theorists work in that area. And so my dissertation was kind of a marriage of those two interests. I was looking at Plato's views on the nature of the emotions and the way that they inform what we know or how we think.
Okay. Yeah. So I think sometimes, I don't know if this has been your experience, but in my experience, I think I've encountered a lot of people who kind of have this idea of philosophy as being very rational, very cognitive, kind of cold, and not very sensitive to the emotional side of human beings. Where do you think that comes from, or why do you think that's the case?
It's funny. I think it comes from Plato in part, but also a very different view of philosophy as this passionate thing that's akin to romantic love. That also comes from Plato. So there's, Plato is kind of a mystery and a paradox because, on the one hand, you can interpret what he's saying to be very rationalistic and to disparage our emotional life. And later philosophers like the Stoics kind of take up some of those ideas. But there's another dimension. And so kind of trying to reconcile those two sides to Plato in a way I find to be kind of a project that involves reconciling our beliefs about emotions. You can think of the sorts of things we say about love, for example. We say love is blind, but we also say follow your heart, right? And so trying to understand how those two things might be true in some sense, but maybe both miss kind of the more complex picture of our emotional life. That's what I was interested in.
Okay. So you've touched on this already a little bit, but specifically about Plato, I think he has this high view of reason and kind of this low view of emotion. Is like emotion needs to be controlled by our reason. I think some would even put him as like an enemy of the modern lifestyle of not being aware of the complexity of human beings and all how we're emotional and all these things. Do you think that that's a right way to understand Plato, or what are your thoughts about that?
So a lot of times it depends which dialogue you're talking about. And of course, since all of Plato's works are written in dialogue form, it may be that you're encountering a view expressed even by Socrates that Plato is exploring, and it may not be his fully fleshed out view, or it may be that his views developed over time. So Plato scholars often try to reconstruct some kind of chronology of his works to account for differences in what he says at one point and another. But I think what people are often going back to is the Republic, what Plato has to say about the emotions in the Republic, specifically Book 4 of the Republic, when he distinguishes between three different parts of the soul. You could think of these as three different kind of sources of human motivation. There's the part that moves us towards the satisfaction of bodily desires. It's sometimes called the appetitive part. There's the part that is has a drive towards honor, recognition, and so on. It's called the spirited part. And then there's the rational part. And these are represented in another work as kind of two horses driven by a charioteer, and the charioteer is reason. So where you get the rationalism and the notion that Plato is kind of suspicious of our emotions is from this distinction and the conclusion that the rational part should rule, right? That the rational part needs to rule and keep in check the other two sources of motivation, that it's reason that makes the judgments about what's good or bad, what's worthy of pursuit, and then it has to kind of harness those other emotions and keep them in check. Otherwise, we're bound to do something that's wrong or unjust.
Right. But it sounds like you're saying that's not the whole picture in Plato.
Right. I think it's not the whole picture. And I mentioned there's this way of representing the three parts of the soul as two horses with the charioteer. That comes from the Phaedrus. And when we get to the Phaedrus, Plato says something very different. He has Socrates, as the character in the dialogue, say to repudiate a rationalistic approach. Halfway through the dialogue, he repudiates something he had said in the earlier part of the dialogue against love. And he says something very interesting. He says, the best things we have come from madness when it is given as a gift of the god. So he had earlier said that love is a kind of madness. And then halfway through the dialogue, he says, but this emotion of love, or you might say this motivation, it's an important gift. And then he goes on to say how it's philosophically valuable. And to use a myth, this myth of the charioteer and the horses, to explain what contribution love has, this passionate side of the human person, to the discovery of knowledge. So one way to reconcile what you're seeing in the Republic and the Phaedrus is to recognize that the emotions are not something that reside in one part of us. If you're using Plato's distinctions between the three different parts of the soul, there are emotions that are proper to the rational part of us.
Okay.
That it's not simply a kind of calculating machine. There's a kind of passionate part to reason as well, and feelings or emotions that are proper to reason as well.
Okay.
So here's where we're kind of entering into my interpretation of things.
Okay.
And this is what I'm putting forward in my dissertation, is that there are emotions or feelings proper to reason, and they play an important cognitive role. They help us to come to discover things rationally that we otherwise might not be able to discover. And so in that sense, they're better because they help us to do those things. But we shouldn't say that the emotions or feelings proper to the other parts are necessarily purely irrational, or that they don't provide some contribution either. So go back to the spirited part of us that I talked about. So this is the part where we're sensitive to how other people think about us. And one of the feelings kind of or emotions proper to that part on Plato's account is shame. And so shame has to do with our perception of our social standing in relation to others. And it provides us valuable information about how we should live. So in the Republic, he tells this story about an individual who sees this. There's this dead body. He sees it. He has this desire to see it. this kind of appetitive kind of curiosity. But there's another part of him, the spirited part, that gets mad at him for wanting to look at it and reacts in a way. And so you see that there's this war within the person, not just between reason and the other two parts, but between the spirited part and the bodily part, that has some sense of shame about what's appropriate to be curious about and what's not. And so Plato suggests that the spirited part and the rational part can team up together to kind of restrain the bodily appetites that we have. So at least when it comes to the spirited part, those emotions that we have that are tied to the desire for to be in kind of a proper social standing with other people, those provide us valuable information about what we should care about, it seems. But it needs to be trained by the rational part. So there's still a hierarchy, and the rational part is what's needed to kind of provide guidance, but it still plays a really important role.
That's helpful. So could you give another example of emotions tied to reason, how the emotions might shape our rational life?
Sure. So going back to the Phaedrus, what he goes on to talk about is through this story about how the soul ascends from its earthly existence to recover its knowledge that it once had in a prior life, recover its knowledge of the truth, of the way things are in themselves, or what Plato would call, knowledge of the forms. So these are the knowledge of the natures of things. And in his description of how that proceeds, he talks about how we begin to ask questions after we've had an encounter with beauty. And this encounter, encounter with physical beauty, moves us emotionally. And it causes us to ask questions about things that we had completely forgotten about. And maybe I should explain, Plato endorses a view of the human person where the soul is immortal and our bodily existence is kind of one stage in our existence, and we had prior stages. And so what we're doing is we're trying to recover the knowledge. When we're doing philosophy, what we're trying to do is to recover the knowledge we once had and we've forgotten. And I don't know if you've had this experience, but sometimes when I'm trying to remember something, the one thing that I can hang on to still is the feeling I had at the time.
Yeah.
So like I remember a joke was funny, and I may remember the particular type of humor that it evoked in me, but I can't tell you the full content of the joke. Maybe I try and I don't make it to the punchline, right? But I can remember how it made me feel.
Yeah.
Right. So I think this is really getting into kind of my interpretation. Other scholars would disagree with me. I think in the Phaedrus, what you find is he's giving an account of how we come to know, how we come to reclaim the knowledge we once had. And it begins with these certain evocative emotional experiences that lead us to wonder and question. It provides a direction for our search. We have some sense of the sort of thing we're looking for because of the emotional experience that we've had. We certainly don't know everything yet. We have a lot more for reason to do. But the emotional part has played an important role in getting us set out on that search and giving us a direction.
Okay, that's helpful. So like another example I'm thinking of, maybe tell me if this is right to you. So if I see someone, if I see my daughter show compassion or show kindness to a stranger or something like that, and that moves me, that might cause me to begin to wonder, well, what is kindness or what is compassion? And I might like begin this quest that's more intellectual. Would that be like another kind of example?
I think so. And
Okay.
and the way I would understand what the emotions are doing is it's a perception of value.
Hmm.
It's not that we can spell out the nature of that value at that point, but it's a starting point. It's a basic source of information. It's something that can go wrong, right? Just like other forms of perception, where our perceptual faculties may be out of whack, where we may misconstrue what it was that we were perceiving. But that is specifically kind of where I fit in Plato's account of the rational emotions, what they are. They're not really judgments about what we should do or about what's good. They're not blind urges. They're something in between. They're giving us some information. They're perceptions of value. And this kind of fits into the landscape in contemporary emotion theory. There are cognitivist theories of the emotions that identify the emotions with particular value judgments that we make. There are non-cognitivist theories that identify the emotions with feelings or something that doesn't involve a kind of cognitive stance per se in the emotion itself. And then there's kind of a middle ground that people just in the last 10 years or so have been exploring, called perceptual accounts of the emotions. It suggests there's a cognitive aspect, but of course, there are other forms of reasoning and cognition that you may need to bring to bear before you say make a judgment about what's good.
So maybe to look at a different figure, at C.S. Lewis, I think of C.S. Lewis's Abolition of Man.
And I remember him talking about, this view of men without chests, and the problem was that we have that kind of modern accounts have failed to recognize, it seemed, the role of the emotions in helping us to apprehend value.
Yeah.
But when I think of, for example, some of the other things he writes about our desire for heaven, and that being kind of our desire for something that cannot be satisfied in anything that we find in this life, and he suggests that's a desire for heaven.
Yeah.
That's a kind of evidence for heaven. I think that when you look at the contents of that desire, what is that? It involves some emotional aspect, right? Or in his discussions of joy, in Surprised by Joy, that's probably the best example. That seems to me to fit this model, where when before Lewis became a Christian, he had these experiences of joy that unsettled him, that didn't fit with the world as he knew it, and they kind of set him off on a quest to try to make sense of the world. So I see that very much fitting within this kind of paradigm that I'm describing and attributing to Plato.
Okay.
And you see it worked out with the Romantics as well, Lewis definitely read, like Coleridge and Wordsworth. They describe a sequence like this, right? Where we're moved by a natural scene, and it leads us on kind of a quest.
Okay.
Was there anything else, Joel, that you wanted to say about emotions or about Plato that we haven't talked about already?
Well, I think for folks that are interested in this, I'd recommend take this lens and read Augustine's Confessions and see what he has to say about the role of joy. And here we see Lewis kind of drawing upon Augustine.
Yeah.
The role of joy in guiding the person back to God and knowledge of God. I see some significant and interesting parallels with the account that you find in the Phaedrus about the soul being brought back to knowledge of the way things are.
Well, thanks a lot, Joel, for talking. I appreciate it.
Thanks. Thank you
Yeah.
very much.